Hello, I'd like to introduce you to Chapter 6 on of Human Anatomy and Physiology on bones, and we're going to break this up into two parts, Chapter 6. Today we're going to cover bone structure, and then later we're going to look at bone growth, development, and bone healing, because those are basically two separate topics. So when we look at bones as an organ, understand that the skeletal system is an organ system, and that literally each bone is an organ in itself. It is not a tissue. We will be looking at bone tissue, but understand that bones are a dynamic structure. They not only contain bone connective tissue, but other connective tissue, and are associated together with joints, but they will contain blood vessels, nerves, and everything else that qualifies each bone as a separate organ itself, working together into an organ system in cooperation with the skeletal system. And we're going to learn a little more about development, but this is just showing a 12-week-old fetus of just to give you an idea of the bone development at that time. And most of this you can see is cartilage, and some of this is already forming into what we call actual bone. So what is the function of our bones? Obviously, they give support to the body, and we know already by going through the positions of organs on the body regions that they're particularly important in protecting soft organs, and sometimes not as completely as we would like it. They also support, and give a place for the lungs to be. They provide protection, and again, in this case, we know that some organs are protected and some are not. From the back perspective, we find that the skeletal system or bones provide ample protection. So we specifically see very much attention given to the brain, the spinal cord within the vertebral columns, and particularly the lungs as a vital organ, and also the posterior organs in your thorax and abdomen. Very important is that the bones serve as levers for muscle action, and this is where they're intimately associated with the skeletal muscular system, because developmentally, these we'll see in a couple of pictures in the next lecture that these two systems develop simultaneously and literally require each other to produce a fully functioning human. Other functions of bones is for storage of materials, and this is why dietary calcium and phosphorus are very important, because your body uses the bones as a storage structure for these. So we're going to see that the muscle and enzymes need lots of calcium to carry out their jobs, and they sometimes have to tap in the bone to do this, because it's the place that we can take calcium out of without causing too much damage to the body. Now, too much pulling out of calcium from the bones can lead to a condition called osteomalacia, not to be confused with osteoporosis, but osteoalacia, which is a softening of the bones due to the removal of calcium tissue, and all you have left is this basically collagen matrix that's kind of soft and fragile. Phosphorus is taken in a diet in various ways, but we need lots of phosphorus for, again, running enzymes and metabolic pathways, and also for the synthesis of ATP. And unfortunately, phosphorus is lost a lot in urine and sweat and feces. And again, the bones become a storage area for this. Now, what's really interesting too, if you take in too much calcium, phosphorus is not a big issue because it gets lost easy, but calcium tends to get stored and will sometimes get stored in soft tissue, or else get stuck in the intestine if we take in too much, and that could lead to pathology. The bone is important in blood cell formation, which we call hematopoiesis. And again, where you're raised depends on how you pronounce this, and I tend to spell this with an E before the A. That's old school. So erythropoiesis is found in what's called the marrow cavities of certain bones, and we'll look at the distribution of that. And believe it or not, in something called yellow marrow, because this would be called red marrow, marrow is actually the content of the bone cavity. We're going to see it's not the cavity itself. We store triglycerides, that means energy fats. So yes, you can have fat bones, but it's interior to the bone. So this tends to be a very important reserve, and particularly in women, okay, because women tend to be more fat metabolizers than glycogen metabolizers. So when we look at the bone as an organ. Let us look at the bone composition, because the bulk of what makes up the bone itself is bone tissue, and we're going to see that this is going to be present in a couple of forms, in what is called laminate bone and also osteon bone. And there is going to be another type of bone material, but it's kind of going to be more of a support structure and shaping structure to the bone. So the bone tissue itself is just one part of the bone organ. Okay, um, we could also find on the bone a connective tissue called periosteum. And periosteum is a connective tissue covering that is separate from the bone tissue itself. And we're going to see that it is continuous with connective tissue that covers tendons and ligaments that attach the bone, and that's also part of the organ structure of bone itself, and also continuous with muscle tissue. So what you find is this periosteum fuses with this material we can call a perium covering over tendon, over ligament, and then the actual what's called perimysium over muscle. So the bones literally are all connected to muscle in this continuous protective coating that prevents electrolyte protection of the water under there, and also we're going to see is a healing membrane. Within the bone, we're going to find a similar structure called endosteum, and we're going to also find either fat storing tissue, yellow marrow, or red marrow, which is blood forming tissue. We're going to see blood vessels associated with bone and also nerves. Then we're going to see something called the articular cartilage, which is hyaline cartilage that caps the articulations, the joint area of bones. So please understand, bone itself, each individual bone, is an organ that develops independently based on this overall body plan of how we lay down the bones. So what else makes up bone? We have the bony tissue, and then we have the skeletal cartilages, which again develop with the bone and musculature development. Now, what's interesting about the skeletal cartilages, you can see, because bone has a lot of blood vessels. Of all the connective tissues, it really has the most blood vessels of anything. I'm going to see bone tissue actually can't form without blood vessels, and are actually birth defects and healing defects that have to do with the improper flow of blood into bones. And we see that divers run into this, and high performance pilots do, because sometimes they'll bust or clot blood cells into bones, and that then prevents healing and eventually can lead to bone death. You can end up with a dead bone inside your body, and eventually it becomes brittle and cracked and then subject to immune system decay. So the cartilages themselves, though, contain no blood vessels or nerves. So you really don't feel pain from the cartilages. You feel pain from nerves in other areas around that, and particularly from things called stretch receptors that are really located in accessory materials called ligaments. So the cartilage itself, which makes up the caps of the bones, the rubbing points of the joints we're going to see, and also cushion points, they're going to be very slow healers and subject to damage, and also subject to sometimes subtle damage where surrounding tissue like muscle and connective tissue tell us what's going on, but not that particular structure in itself. So it's usually a connective tissue girdle we're going to see with something called a perichondrium that is continuous with the periosteum. And that's a problem with perichondrium, because if it gets attacked or defective, that tends to affect every, not only periosteum, but perichondrium and even the muscle coverings. Of the skeletal cartilages, we're going to find the most common one we see associated with joints is going to be hyaline cartilage, and we've seen this already in the histology chapter. It's going to provide shaping and support for the joint surface, and also provide almost like a lubricating surface. And think of it like Teflon in a pot. It's a very smooth, lubricating surface. Any damage to that surface, any pitting, can lead to problems, and bacterial infections and arthritis could basically do that. And then we have what are called the elastic cartilage. This is very similar to hyaline cartilage. Remember, if we put elastin fibers in there, and we're going to see that this is used mostly as a cushion and body support. And then we're going to see fibrocartilage. This is going to be more for a tough tensile strength that prevents bone to help, I should say, it holds together bone very tightly. So when bone is pulling on bone, it has the strength of that collagen fiber. It's not so much for elasticity and bending as much as holding the body stiff. And we're going to see where these are found when we look at articulations. So these are the three cartilage. And remember what cartilage is. It's almost a solid fibrous matrix that provides some type of shape or support for the body. So when we look at the skeleton now, and literally the organs of the skeletal system, here obviously we can see the bones, we can see the cartilage, okay, which provides support and facilitates movement, and these are some major cartilage areas, okay, and this doesn't show obviously the blood vessels and any of the muscle attachments, which are accessory organs that go into the system. And this kind of shows you coloration of different parts of the skeleton we're going to get to a little later in the course. So when we look at the growth of cartilage, because this is important, because cartilage, just like bone, is a living tissue. Okay, and we can see that, and cartilage is also going to be the foundation for bone. So this is very important when we look at the bone structure itself, because the baby starts out with cartilage, and our own cartilage attaches to the bone during development and forms by two different growth methods. So we're going to learn about what's called appositional growth. And this is basically what happens when you have an existing cartilage and then along comes new cartilage. Literally cells migrate into the area and attach themselves to that older matrix, and they can build themselves upon it, particularly as layers or as a surrounding. So this is when a new matrix is basically formed in what we call the external face of an existing cartilage. And this is very important in maturation. It's very important in what we call reactive tissue. That means the body's reaction to stress. It can make cartilage thicker or actually change the shape of the cartilage to deal with the force of pressure and the force of pulling on joints and bone and muscle and other structures. And then we're going to learn about what's called interstitial growth. This is literally when just basically what we call de novo, that means out of nowhere, literally chondroblasts fill in a tissue. They just kind of, these new cells come into a tissue, and then what happens is they just form a matrix around them without pre-existing tissue. What happens once this new tissue is formed, let's say with bone formation, bone cells can migrate into the cartilage, and we'll see how this is done. This is why the periosteum is very important. We're going to learn it's a house, a depository for osteoblasts. So osteoblasts will move in here and fill that hyaline cartilage matrix with hydroxyapatite, with the filler material of bone, and then eventually turn that bone into bone tissue. And you're going to see that within the bone, you're going to see this almost type of interstitial, this cycle of interstitial and then appositional growth that maintains bone. Okay, so when we look at the calcification of bone tissue, this is very typical of normal bone growth and maintenance. Bone maintenance requires a constant tearing down and rebuilding of bone tissue, usually through a cycle of interstitial and appositional growth. During old age, we find out that the calcification doesn't occur as much, and during pathology, we sometimes even see decalcification. And guys, what's important to understand is any type of connective tissue can calcify. And this is looking at a horrible condition where literally the perimysium and the perichondrium of tissues, and even sometimes the hypodermis, literally cells from the muscle covering, can migrate into the hypodermis and cause calcification and literally turn the skin and tendons and ligaments into sheets of thin, paper-thin bone that cracks and rips and prevents that person from moving. So imagine all of your skin turning solid, and imagine the pain if you have this bone, sheets of fragile bone forming in you, and it's ripping and tearing. Not a nice way. And there's YouTube videos on this you can look at, and whatever with some of these conditions. These are called osteogenic diseases, and it could occur literally in any tissue. I've actually seen this occur in animals, and I've seen this occur in fetuses. If a fetus died in utero, and sometimes the mother doesn't know it, because sometimes the baby does not rot, and if not, mom is not giving any prenatal care, the baby could actually undergo calcification and actually become almost a mummified baby. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate again, when we start looking at the bones of the skeleton, we're going to break the skeleton down into the axial skeleton, and we've discussed this before, that the axial skeleton is very important because this is also called the primitive skeleton or ancestral skeleton. That means we see the skeleton in very primitive fish and eel-like creatures. And this is also found in very ancient sea life, except instead of having skeleton, they have cartilage, a hyaline cartilage, very much like us. So the axial skeleton is going to be composed of obviously the skull. We talked about this before. The vertebral column. Okay, rib cage, because we had learned that ribs are actually made up of bone that basically generates from the spinal column. We see this in fish particularly, and that's the axial skeleton, right down to the last vertebrae. Now the appendicular skeleton, meaning these is a separate set of bones that are under a separate set of genes, and these genes are paired. That means your arms grow in pairs, your leg grow in pairs, and there's an overruling gene that basically controls how these two grow in general. And we know that this is species dependent, ethnic origin dependent, and also gender dependent. Men and women have a different rate of growth of the upper and lower appendages. So this is really kind of neat when we look at the genetics of how the skeleton develops. So the arms and legs come in pairs, and this is kind of funny. This is why you have a thumb and a big toe, because really the thumb is more important than the big toe. And it's just that as the thumb develops, the genes that produce the thumb also overlap and contribute to the growth of the big toe. And we're not going to argue too much about if there's a real purpose to the big toe or not. What if it was replaced by a little toe? Now we know the thumb is important. Okay, but when we look at the appendicular skeleton also, okay, we're going to see it has movable joints compared to the axial skeleton, which is going to have more support and stabilizing joints. We're going to see that the cartilage is a little different and the types of joints are a little different. Now, another thing about the appendicular skeleton, in the upper part of our body, it is not fused. In the lower part of the body, it is tightly fused by a suture to the sacrum, which is one of the part of the vertebral column. Now, in all animals, that is not true. So just in us, we see this tight attachment here that really provides us with a lot of rear leg strength and support. And this becomes eventually our weight-bearing bones because of our two-legged stance. So now we have the classification of axial and appendicular. Now we're going to get into the little tricky aspect of looking at, as we view a bone, how do we classify the bone? And people, there is debate about this. In the anatomy and physiology book that I wrote, I have people that debate how we classify this, but the classification sometimes overlaps with the embryological development. It's also based on how we perceive the shape of the bone. So bone shape is truly dependent on the development of that bone. Also, what we learn is that the appendicular skeleton develops from a structure called a bone peg, which is different than some of the bones that develop in the axial skeleton. So we have these things called long bones, and long does not mean it's big and long. Long means that it's longer than it is wide. And that is not going to be as obvious because you'll see sometimes a bone like this. And yes, it's longer than it's wide, but it's not necessarily true. Then we're going to see there is something called short bones. These bones are actual squares, and there's some debate about this. Go by where they're found. Okay, long bones are going to be mostly found in the appendicular skeleton, associated with the fingers, okay, the toes, the arms, and legs, both upper arm, lower arm, upper leg, lower leg. Okay, the short bones are typically going to be found in wrist and ankle, what we're going to later call carpals and tarsals. And we're going to see that they're a very special type of joint, complex joint, that these short bones are going to provide a very rigid, restricted type of movement, but also involves very complex movement, like cupping your hand. Okay, and also having extreme range, strong motion of the wrist. Um, under short bones, we're going to see something called sesamoid bones. These are bones that actually develop as calcifications in the tendons, which includes your patella, your kneecap. Your kneecap is not a real bone, it's a tendon bone. We're going to see, or a ligament bone actually is what it is, because it's actually found within a ligament tendon complex. So remember, tendons connect muscle to bone, ligaments we're going to see connect bone to bone. And sometimes there's an overlap and a blending in complex joints like the knee, the wrist, and the hip and shoulder. So sesamoid bones can form particularly in what we call reactive areas. That means they can form in the web of the hand. They can form between your toes. They just form as an extra strengthening tool to give more strength to tendons and prevent them from stretching as much and ripping. So we do find these growing all over the place, and they are sort of like seed shape or cube shape. Sesame is because they're small and actually look like kind of sesame seeds. We then have the flat bones, and we're going to see these are totally developmentally different than long bones and the short bones. These develop by a totally different bone growing process that usually relies on that overlying tissues to help develop them. That means they form in an area between basically muscle and the hypodermis, and they're actually probably part of the hypodermis complex. And then we have irregular bones, and these are bones that that have very complicated shapes. They're usually going to be very supportive bones. We find them both in the axial and the appendicular skeleton, and sometimes they're actually bones that are fused together. Matter for the most part, if you find an irregular bone, it's several short bones and flat bones fused together. The embryology of the skeleton is incredible, and I was lucky once to work when I was working as an animal pathologist at the New York Zoological Society's New York Aquariums lab. We had a friend of mine who worked in a very weird little basement type facility with all the fish and stuff in jars and containers. He was a shark bone expert, and he had these techniques of looking at the embryology of sharks throughout time, and he was able to make this he was able to clarify the skin, turn the skin and all the muscle invisible. You just remove all the proteins that add color to the body, and you can see right through the skin into the bones. And then he introduced a stain that stained the cartilage separately from the bone tissue, and it was incredible to look at how irregular bones form in those animals, which is very similar to us. So here we look at some examples. And unfortunately, this will be on your test, probably on your practical. I mean, I know on your practical, and this is also could be on your second lab exam. I mean, your second lecture exam. So here's a long bone, and they always happen to pick a big bone, like the humerus or like the femur. But look at the long bone, of course, length greater than width. Okay, but there's some long bones too, even though they're kind of short and small. Then we have the short bones. Now notice the short bone. That sort of looks like something out of Stonehenge. Okay, so for the short bones, they're just a regular shape and they can look like a cube. But the important thing is with a short bone, it's very hard to tell the length from the width. Now this one, because of its articular surface, the talus, it's kind of probably on the category of a very weird long bone. But we classify it as short bone mostly because, again, when we look at it overall without the cartilage caps, it is kind of cube shaped. Here's your flat bones. Sternum is an example, okay? And there's the manubrium of your sternum, which is actually a separate flat bone in itself. I've seen many deformities of these that has to do with deformities of the tissue that forms it. And these are some flat bones here. And I don't say they're round. They're flat just means they take on the shape of the structures around it. Okay, so in the case of the flat bones of the skull, it takes the shape of the skull, of the brain underneath it and the tissues that cover the brain. And then here's your irregular bones. You have the equivalent of like a short bone there, and then you have the equivalent of almost short bone or flat bone. I'm going to see that also in the scapula, which is not shown here. So there's your flat bones and uh, um, part of it. And look at this. This is the flat bone part also of your hip bone. So these irregular bones are found, again, in very strange areas. Now, this is the thing the students hate, what are called bone markings. These are bulges, dents, holes that all serve as either sites for muscle attachment, ligament, or tendon. Again, ligament is an attachment of bone to bone. This is what holds rigidity to the bones and holds the bones together so you don't kind of fall apart. Tendons hold the muscle to the bone. So these pull on the bone and they tug the bone. And the harder you work your muscles and skeletal system, these tend to pull on them and pull markings onto the bones. If you look at a fetal skeleton, their bones are smooth. There's almost no markings. And then when they get older, you'll start seeing ridges and dents, and also blood vessels and nerves and muscles will push on the bone. Remember, bone is a living tissue and constantly replacing itself. So it always goes through these soft phases. So guys, if I was to take a finger on a baby and keep my finger poked on the baby's head, as that baby is growing and I keep pushing, we can eventually make a giant pit, a divot in that kid's head that basically forms a depression, a deep depression. Now, why you want to do that, I don't know, but it's but people in older times have actually put flat boards on babies' heads and other thing, and women have actually had their feet bounded to restrict the bone growth, and it produces very unusual depressions or markings on these people. Bone markings are also joint surfaces, particularly where the cartilage falls off. And again, they're going to be openings for blood vessels and nerves. Because remember, bone's an organ, and things and blood vessels and nerves have to get in there. So the major bone organs I want you to at least define. And I may ask you a couple of these on a test. Because guys, if you're people in radiology, use these as markers. We could actually go onto a patient and feel these depressions and crests and whatever and use them as an indicator of where to aim that x-ray to. And particularly in the, some of the tuberosities, these bulges that come out where there's very strong muscle attachments, physicians can use this as an indicator of how much stress has been put on that body. We can look at whether a person died as a manual labor or died in a desk job. We can look at if they've been a lot of injured, if they had tearing of that, and how much weight they may have carried on their own bodies. Because obese people tend to put a lot of pressure on their bones, and it shows a lot of compression marks and a lot of the force of the muscles and ligaments working on those bones. So we have things called tuberosities. You're going to see these. These are rounded projections. Know this because some of these are going to be areas of the bone you have to identify. These are very important location sites for looking at major joints. We have crests, which you'll see what that is. Trochanter basically means an area that's used as a lever on a bone. We have lines, which are sometimes confused with processes. We have what's called a tubercle, what is called an epicondyle. A condyle we're going to see is the end of a particular large jointed bone. We have spines, again, which are sometimes confused with crests. Okay, and then we have process, which some small processes people think can see as a narrow, as a short crest or also a tuberosity. The ones you basically have to know for class, the ones I'm most interested in, because these are actually palpation points on a patient, particularly for positioning, for x-ray, and for looking for certain subcutaneous features, are the tuberosities, the crest, particularly the iliac crest. The trochanter is very important because this is what tells you particularly the lower appendages, okay? A spine, because you're going to deal with the spinous complex process, and also the term process. So tuberosity, crest, trochanter, spine, and process, you definitely need to know. Epicondyles are a little more exotic. These are almost equivalent to trochanters. This is almost like in the leg. That's like in the arm. But again, this terminology is very freaky. Just memorize these terms and hopefully you'll never see them again unless you go into radiology or sometimes kinesiology or physical therapy, because these are points in physical therapy where we have to pay attention to particularly restraint and also where we put prosthetic devices. So tuberosity, okay, there's a nice ischial tuberosity, and actually tuberosity means it looks like a potato. I don't normally see that, but it's a giant bump. We will see these in class. When we start going through the skeletal system itself, you will see these in class. So these are large rounded projections. But the best thing to remember is the one right here on the pelvic girdle. Okay, then we have the crest. There's your iliac crest. And don't say it's not narrow. The crest, make believe it's something you can walk across. Okay, it's sort of like a mountain ridge. But this is your most prominent crest because this tells you where the pubic area gets separated from the abdominal area. And it kind of gives you also an indicator of how high the kidneys are and where the top of the uterus is if you're a female. So this is an example of a crest. Then we have a trochanter, and the most important trochanter is the greater and lesser trochanter of the femur. These are points for particularly for finding where the hip bones are. Okay, so we know where that hip joint is, and I've used these before to place an x-ray to kind of get the best angle, because sometimes I have to do an angle like this and then an angle like that to see particularly if there was a fracture in the head of that femur, and I took feeling that trochanter, sometimes at a protest of the patient. Okay, so a line, let's see where we got a line here. Where is that little guy? Okay, there we go. There's a line. Let me get rid of the background. We find a line here, and you can also see lines on the, because this is the anterior view of the femur, on the posterior view of the femur, where you have the large muscle groups kind of attaching. So lines are either attachment points for capsule cups, joint cups, or sometimes when you have two muscles together, coming together and attaching along that bone. Tubercles, okay, where do we see them here? Oh, there we go. So a tubercle is just a little notch. It's a capsule attachment point, because what we have here is you can see where your knee is, that capsule right there. So that's actually ligament and tendon attached in there, and then muscle. So it's a multiple point, and it's just basically a pull point. It's a lever point. The same is true for epicondyles. There's your epicondyle, and that's going to be harder to see because this bone has both a tubercle, which holds a capsule, and then the epicondyle, which is right here, where it's part of the muscle attachment, and then you have the joint area, which is called the condyle. I know this is confusing, but just memorize these definitions for the ones I gave you. Then we have, and we just mentioned epicondyle, okay, and then we have your, yeah, we mentioned the spine, and then a process, which is any bony ridge. And usually these are going to be, oh, there we go, the spinous process. This has to be one of the longer bony ridges. Let me point you to right now where that is. It's right here. And this happens to be a cartilage, actually connective tissue attachment point that supports the vertebral column in movement. So again, look at the pictures, look at real bones, try to identify some of the major ones, and we're going to go this in class before you take your practical exam. Some of the more prominent projections, bone markings, are going to be what's called the head, and this is usually going to be an articular surface. Most of these now are articular surfaces. The facet, we're going to see these particularly are going to be flatter surfaces on particularly the short bones. You find these a lot in the wrist bones, the carpals, or in the tarsals, the ankle bones. Condyles, we're going to see our rounded projections. The head is more of, has a neck and a rounded projection. This is going to be more like that, like we see in the humerus. This would be more in the femur. And then a ramus means an arm alike. So it's going to look sort of like something like this, like a bend. And the ramus you're going to see actually in the mandible, the lower jaw. So where do you find these? Believe it or not, the ribs have a head. There's the head. There's the neck. So let's go through that again. There's the head. It's a little runny protrusion. Then you see the neck. We have facets. Where's a facet? That's going to be a little dent right here. You'll see better facets. Actually, that's a little facet too. So it's going to be like a little divot, a little dent, like a basin. You're going to see where where bone comes to bone to form a joint. And then you see another example of a condyle. Okay, and then there's your ramus. Right here, it's going to lead to a little arm-like projection, like your forearm coming off of your arm. And now some of the other bone markings are going to be, and that's pronounced meatus, not meatus. Let's meet us here tomorrow. Meatus. Meatus just means a large opening. It's like a canal, so this is usually a large opening that's deep. It runs through a passageway, because the passageway itself is actually meatus. We see that there's something called a sinus, and this is be actually a cavity that's usually enclosed. It might have a meatus or other things going into it, which is usually an enclosed cavity we usually see within specific bones, particularly irregular bones in the skull. We're going to see something called a fossa. This is going to be a shallow basin-like depression. Okay, that's going to usually be where a large muscle comes in contact with bone. We're going to see grooves, which is a furrow, and this is usually going to be where a slender muscle or some type of very thick tendon comes in contact, and sometimes maybe a large nerve tract presses on bone and just presses a divot into the bone. We have fissures, which are a little more narrow-like and small, and I know this is a lot, guys. And then foramen, it's pronounced foramen, not like foreman. Okay, these are small holes that, yes, they do have passageways, but these are tiny holes or ovals, holes or ovals that are usually where blood vessels and small branches of nerve go into the bone. And there's some major ones on the skull that are. Okay, so when we start looking at these structures, okay, for the bone markings, we have a furrow or a groove, okay, and we're going to see one right here. Again, this is a very strong muscle attachment. It's a muscle pull point, okay, that helps that jaw to open and close. When we look at a fissure, fissure just means crack. So there's a nice one right in the orbit of the eye. You'll see these on the skull. You see fissures in other places. This is probably the most prominent one. And then we're going to see a foramen. So, where is that little guy right here? Okay, there we go. There's a foramen. Okay, and we're going to see that we have a large foramen here, the foramen magnum. Okay, which is where the spinal cord goes into the brain. Most of the foramen you see are very small. That's why this is called the big hole. Okay. We have some notches, and you see various notches along the way. There's a notch right there, okay, in your jawbone, and it just looks like someone cut out a notch right at the top of your lower jawbone, your mandible, okay. And then the meatus is going to be a tunnel-like projection, and this happens to be, and you're going to have what's called the external auditory meatus. That's the easiest one to find, which is where the opening of your ear starts and goes into your temporal bone. And then the sinuses, of course, buried away, and let's see where they buried away the sinus right here. There's a nice sinus right there, and there's a nice frontal sinus right there, and there are other sinuses that were cut because we don't see those bones. And then we have the fossa right here, which is to be kind of like a basin depression right here on the inside of your skull. And guess what sits there? That's going to be a structure called your cerebellum. And you're going to see several basins in the pelvic girdle and in the skull. And again, it just looks like a bowl, a large bowl. So let's now get into the tissue itself, the bone tissue itself, and look at what's called bone textures. Okay, so bone texture. We can divide bone into two types of texture. Compact bone, which is more typical of dense connective tissue. That means it's mostly fibers, no, very little airspace, and a pretty good density of cells. Compact bone is shown right here, and you're going to see that there's going to be two types of compact bone in the skeleton. There's going to be what's called the osteon bone. You're going to come to that later. Whoops. And then what's called that little tiny surface there, right where the periosteum is, that's going to be called a laminate bone. This is going to be flat sheets, and this is going to be this little circular growth you see here, which is actually concentric or appositional sheets. And then there's the spongy bone, or what's called cancellous bones, which just means full of holes. It looks like a honeycomb. And don't worry about the term trabecula, because it's sometimes called trabecular bone. And trabecular are just these little type ridges that you see. So the spongy bone, that's the bone, and those are the gaps here. So this is all the gaps. So this bone is sort of like just ridges of bone that run throughout, and it's mostly going to be space. Compact bone is for support, strength. It's also for attachment points to muscle, tendon, and ligament. Spongy bone is a lightweight bone. It helps to make the skeleton lighter, but what it also does is it acts as a filler bone. That means it gives shape. So compact bone gives strength. Spongy bone gives shape, but what it also does is give a cushion. So if you jump off a chair or jump off a table, the spongy bone is a compression that prevents the compact bone from cracking. It's a beautiful design in a bone. And you can see when we look at joints, particular, the joint itself is a very, very delicate balance between laminate compact, osteon compact, and spongy bone to give you both durability, strength, but also a cushion. Now, guys, the most common bone in your body, and actually not by number as much as just what you see and what we study, is going to be the long bones. Because these are the most obvious, they're the easiest to see, and they have the most distinct structures. They're the most versatile of your bones. We're going to see that they carry out the most jobs for the skeleton too. Whereas most of your non-long bones are used for just movement and body shape. These have other purposes. So when we look at the gross structure of the long bone, that means the overall structure, we have two major features, what's called a diaphysis, and physis just means the structure. Dia means to go across. So this is basically the long part of your long bone. It's the part that goes across the bone. So this is called your diaphysis. And if I ever ask this, I will tell you, I will have a pointer saying, which part of the bone from here to here is at. Now, the ends of the bone, we're going to eventually call epiphyses. It means it sits upon the physis, the structure of the bone, the body of the bone. Okay, so the diaphysis, we're going to see, is mostly going to be made of what is called compact collar bone. That means a fairly good thick layer of laminate bone and a thick layer of osteon bone. This is a collar. It basically provides us the strength we need and the flexibility we need. It means ability to flex a little for the bone. And it's going to surround what's called a medullary cavity, which is going to be right here. Your medullary cavity, that is not called the marrow. People get that wrong in the exam. The marrow is going to be a tissue that's found in the medullary cavity of most of these long bones and a couple of flat bones that have a medullary cavity. So the medulla just means kind of like that center region there, that cavity inside. So what else do we see on long bones? Okay, besides the fact that there's a medullary cavity, some long bones have yellow marrow, which stores fat. We're going to see, and that's true for most long bones. So most of your long bones are fat storage. And guys, this happens actually to be a problem when people get amputations, is they're losing reserves of calcium and fat. But what also happens, we learned, is that they're also losing a source of calories. Bone maintenance requires a fair amount of calories, and so do the muscles of that appendage too. So this is really kind of an interesting thing when we look at people that do have amputations. There are metabolic regulatory issues that do cause problems. Again, structure of long bone, let's look at the epiphyses. Okay, so that's this region right there, and basically the section between the epiphysis and the diaphysis is called the metaphysis. Don't worry about that. I mostly care that you worry about the epiphysis, because this is only distinct on bones that have a neck, this little region there. So the epiphysis is a separate bone. It is called a bony cap, because what happens in fetal development, all your long bones start out as a diaphysis, which is also called a shaft, and two little cartilaginous caps. And these eventually grow and harden. These stay cartilage for a while until this bone matures, and then they become full bone themselves. So actually, every one of your long bones and some of your short bones, actually, some of your short bones are actually composed of three bones that seal together. So the epiphyseal covering is a bone itself, and on most bones you'll see what's called an epiphyseal line. This is the remnant of what's called the growth plate. That means when you get bigger, this is what's kind of funny about bone. Bone increases in length here. That means as new bone cells grow, new bone cells, remember the skin grows by putting skin on top of skin. So as new bone cells grow, a new layer is formed here from that green line. Then that red layer gets pushed up, okay, because, gets pushed up. Sorry about that. Because there's now another new red layer. And then as a new red layer gets built by the green layer, the bone grows that way. And it pushes that head up. In bones that don't have a head like that, that green layer is of course going to be here, and then that pushes that up. So that's bone growth. Literally your epiphyses and the tips of your bones get pushed apart. And this is where gravity plays a funny role, is that gravity and weight could put pressure on those epiphyses and actually slow down bone growth. And the bones actually become thicker compared to the length. This is why there was an old saying, if you just lay down in your whole life in bed with no standing up at all, you actually be a little longer, but your bones will also be thinner and not be able to support your weight. This is called reactive growth. And that's very important. If you're going to walk upright, stay upright. If we walked on all fours as a person, you'd actually have a different type of bone growth in your hands because they now became weight-bearing bones. Okay, associated with the epiphysis is going to be the articular surface. Please know that, articular surface, and this is usually going to be covered with hyaline cartilage, maybe with other types of cartilage, but usually hyaline cartilage, okay, to form a joint surface. So again, here's a long bone, diaphysis, epiphyses. This is the humerus. Unlike the femur, now you can hardly see the neck. There's your epiphyseal seal. So you don't really have a metaphysis in this one. It's hard to see. There's your cartilage. That's your periosteum, laminate collarbone, spongy collarbone, osteon compact bone, and your spongy bone. And there's your blood vessels running through there. And there will also be nerves in there too, usually. So when we look at the membranes of the bone, the periosteum, we're going to see that there's an outer fibrous layer, an inner what's called osteogenic layer. These are different. The fibrous layer is a protective covering. It holds in water, salts, it acts as a barrier. It also hopefully prevents bacteria from invading. This is why when you cut the periosteum, it could be a dangerous thing. And if the periosteum is ever inflamed, things could literally travel through it. So this is a protective layer. Then we have an inner osteogenic layer, which is more or less a site for cells. It's a repository for cells. So the cells we find there are inactive osteoblasts. These are there particularly for bone restructuring. That means bone is constantly being torn down, and these guys have to fill in and take the job of building new bone. And then they turn into what are called osteocytes, which kind of maintain the bone. So think of the osteoblasts as someone comes in, tears down a room in your house. You have a builder come in and build a new room, and then you sit in the house now, and your job now is the osteocyte taking care of that room in a way. Or the builders turn into the occupied room, and anything that happens, they do patch it and repair it. So the osteoblasts typically can stay in there once they build new bone, okay, and then take on the job of an osteocyte. Osteoclasts are bone destroying cells. We believe they come from the immune system. We believe that they're really a type of jumbo white blood cell whose job is to eat stuff. Because guys, part of your immune system is to eat dead tissue, macrophages and other types of cells that do that. So osteoclasts are probably related to macrophages in the immune system. And the problem with them is they're always at work. They are always eating. We could basically entice them to work faster through different factors. But generally what we do is we produce hormones that kind of keep them in check. So they're constantly working. And then it's the job of osteoblasts to kind of replace what they tear down. Then there's osteogenic cells. These are actually primitive stem cells, much related to what you find, like blood cells in the red marrow that are there to produce what is needed. So they're capable of making osteoblasts. But again, they're a little more primitive. These are there as quick resources. They got to get out there. These are kind of like a backup if you run out of these. So once these are used, they come and fill in because osteogenic cells are the only things that can form osteoblasts. Osteoblasts turn into osteoclasts, which are the mature bone-maintaining cells. So what else is the periosteum? It is an attachment and conduit for nerve fibers, nutrient blood vessels, lymphatic vessels that penetrate a little hole in the periosteum, a sealed hole, come to think of that, and then gets into the bone tissue itself. And something else about the periosteum, it uses these little special fibers called Sharpie fibers that really attaches that thing to the bone. It's very hard to pull periosteum off. And usually what you do is you end up tearing off the Sharpie's fibers. So this is the periosteum. And then there's the endosteum, which everybody forgets about. It is a very delicate membrane lining the internal cavity, the medullary cavity of the bones. And this basically serves the role of the lower layer of the periosteum because there's really no protection that they do. They're not really a covering because the inside of the bone is typically sterile unless you had a very, very bad systemic disease carried in from the blood into that area. So this is usually a home to osteoblasts and osteoclasts. That means it doesn't have the ability to regenerate osteoblasts. Osteoblasts have to migrate there from the periosteum. This is what it all looks like. Your endosteum is a very thin layer. It literally covers the tubercle of the spongy bone also, okay, depending on the bone. There's your periosteum peeled off. You can see the Sharpie's fibers and notice the blood vessels literally right underneath there. Penetrates the holes right underneath there and the blood vessels travel underneath and also above. There's some underneath ones. A nerve that comes in would do a very similar thing. Okay, so really that's it for. Okay, now with short, irregular, and flat bones, we're out of long bones. They are also covered by periosteum. Some of them have endosteum because a lot of irregular, short, and flat bones do have a thin layer of spongy inside as sort of to shape them. And you will find some endosteum, but not to the extent of what you find in long bones. And this is just kind of weird. And don't ask me why we do this. A separate researcher discovered that flat bones have this thin, spongy bone, which you find in every other bone, but they just decided to call it diploid. Don't worry about that. But if you see that term, know what it is. It's a fancy name for spongy bone found in flat bones. It means you see this in the skull, in the scapula, and in the sternum. Okay, and again, the bone, and then you do find in some flat bones a marrow that's within the trabeculae. So instead of it being in a cavity, it's actually located in the gaps in the spongy bone. So here's a typical flat bone. There's your diploid or your spongy area. Okay, there's your spongy area. And in here, you will find marrow. Not all the time, but marrow. Okay, and this marrow is a very important site of when we want to collect blood producing cells from a person, because we can take the marrow out and actually clone the marrow in a lab because it kind of does its own thing. We just have to provide it with the right hormones and environment, something called bovine serum. They have to have blood serum and a whole bunch of factors to do their job, or else it doesn't work out right. So now let's look at the hematopoietic function of bone. And guys, this is so important. In babies, fetuses, the liver is the hematopoietic tissue. And believe it or not, adults still have the genes that turn on bone blood cell formation. But the problem is it's usually going to be fetal blood. Getting adult blood out of the liver is very difficult. And we're going to see also that certain cells in the hematopoietic tissue require passage through a gland called the thymus, and they mature sometimes in areas called lymph nodes. So when we look at the bone marrow, this is usually where we find juvenile uninitiated bone cells, particularly with the red marrow. So the red marrow inside the medullary cavity of adults in general, not in fetuses, you're going to find predominantly in the heads of the femur and the humerus. Okay, you're also going to find it in the trabecular cavities of the long bones. And again, in newborns, we find red marrow in all spongy bone. This is kind of funny, but and then it moves from the liver. And it's actually liver cells moving into there in the fetus, and then eventually, as the baby grows and as the bones get bigger, we don't need that ratio of blood cell formation anymore. This is showing the locations. So guys, when we do see red marrow in the shafts of the bone, the diaphysis, it's usually going to be somewhere around here. You're mostly going to find yellow marrow in there because that yellow marrow is actually feeding the hematopoietic tissue. So when we look at this, we're going to see, again, these darkened spots are where most hematopoiesis takes place. And that's why, again, when people get amputated and they lose a joint, particularly that joint, that's significant. The same is true here, too. When people break a hip or the epiphysis in damage, that affects hematopoiesis. So this is very bad, particularly in elderly women that break hips, because when that hip is broken or shattered, that could affect a significant portion of the hematopoiesis. So we pay a lot of attention to bone damage, particularly in the sternum, towards the back of the ribs. Notice the vertebral column is a hematopoietic tissue, but predominantly right about here. And a lot of times when we sample for hematopoietic tissue or want to take it out and clone it in a lab, we usually take it from the sternum because it's easy to find and it's easier to drill here than to drill right through all that dense bone of the joints, or we go right here in the hip, which is a problem because we have to pass a lot of muscle. So we try to go through the back of the hip to where the crest is, right above that crest, and kind of push the muscle away, or we take a big plug out of the sternum. But understand that when these bone areas are damaged or shattered, that can turn off hematopoiesis. So now, unfortunately, let's look at the microscopic anatomy of bone, because this is now the histology of bone. And we're going to have to know a little histology of bone, not only for the lab practical, but, just to understand how bone tissue works in general. So when we look at the cells of bones, we have what are called osteogenic cells. And these are stem cells that are usually present, again, in the periosteum somewhat in the endosteum. And we think that they migrate into the endosteum, but they live and are produced in the periosteum. Then there's the osteoblast. That means a stem cell grows into an osteoblast, which is sort of a bone secreting cell. That means that's its job. It's building, secreting bone. This shows what they look like. Wow, if you see one walking down the street. But again, it's just that this converts to this based on need. And then we have the actual osteocytes. Now think of osteocytes as they're mature osteoblasts. So what happens is that once they become an osteocyte, their main job is maintenance. That means they see a little crack, they lose some calcium, they put some back, but they're not really secreting cartilage. Their main job is that when you lose calcium and phosphate from the bone tissue, they replace it. When a little protein gets lost from the bone tissue, they replace it because the bones are constantly breaking down. Osteoclasts are constantly eating it, and these guys are there constantly reforming it. And then there's the osteoclast, which clast actually means to break. So what they're doing is actually reabsorbing the bone. It means they're eating the bony matrix, the protein, they're dissolving out the calcium. And generally what happens with bone tissue is when you're using your bones for storage, osteocytes help to come in and incorporate the extra calcium and phosphorus into your bone. When your body needs calcium and you're not eating it, osteoclasts are activated, or at least they're let to go loose. And what they do is they tear down the protein, tear down the calcium, the hydroxyapatite, and they take the calcium, they take the phosphorus and release it from the bone into the blood. So here's what an osteocyte looks like, and you'll see this in what's called the lacunae of the bone tissue, and these are going to be in little structures called canaliculi. You know what's really cute? This is like a love story. They are reaching out to other osteocytes, and sometimes they feed each other, because what we're going to learn is that certain osteocytes are nearer to the blood vessels than others. So this one, let's say he's nearer to what's called the Haversian canal, he will get the food from the blood vessels and give him a little so he can get food. So it's sort of like you sitting next to the waiter and the waiter passes you food to another person, which of course you take your cut and hopefully make it equitable. And then here's the osteoclast. It has all the appearances of a white blood cell. And guys, these are multiple nuclei. So this is either a cell that starts out as one that divides its internal parts without dividing the cell in itself. So it might be multiple cells living together, or it might be a bunch of cells that come together and fuse. Sort of like the way skeletal muscle develops. You'll learn a little later. Okay, so that's it for the cells. Now what we find is the microscopic anatomy of the bone tissue itself. The most important structures for you is going to be the Haversian canal system or the osteon system. Osteon is the unit of tissue of compact bone. So we're going to see that there's several terms you need to know. The lamellate bone, laminate means flat sheets. Like to laminate something means to make it a flat sheet. This bears the weight, it bears the support. And then there's a central region called the Haversian or Havishon, depending on how you want to pronounce it, or what we sometimes call it is the central canal, because Americans don't like saying Haversian or Havishon. Again, this contains blood vessels and nerves. The central canal, we're going to see is a small opening in the center of the osteum. So guys, this has been the hardest part of understanding bone tissue. But think about the osteon as this, is you have these blood vessels, okay, which are the nutrient source for the bone. So what happens is that the bone forms. Blood vessels literally kind of eat their way through into there. And this is thanks to osteoclasts drilling holes. So they kind of eat their way through into there, because what bone tissue does, it produces a chemical called angiogenesis attracting factor. What that means is that it teases, it sends a chemical out that blood vessels just love to grow into. So make believe you have kind of like this hole there, and now a blood vessel grows into it. What's happening now is the blood vessel is nurturing the growth of bone cells. And so what happens here is you'll see bone cells here start feeding off, and let me do a different color for that. So bone cells here start getting their nutrients from the blood vessels, and as they grow, another layer of cells grows here, another layer goes here, and another layer goes here. So from the top, you'll see this in a minute, you have these concentric rings. If we're looking from the top here, you have these concentric rings of cells. There's your opening. One layer here, one layer here, and then one layer here, and they keep adding new layers in these concentric rings, making the osteon type of growth. So this is the layers of the osteon. They're just showing each layer, layer that grows. And it has usually collagen fibers that wrap around that to provide strength and flexibility. This is kind of cool, besides this hyaline cartilage type stuff that the bone grew into. So the osteon is sort of like a tube. It tapers at the end, then it has these concentric rings of bone cells. And each long bone is made up of thousands of these stacked on top of, I mean millions, I should say, literally, in the whole body, stacked on top of each other and close to each other like this. And sometimes one dies, okay, and these tend to try to go out to fill it in, that little area. So let's look at these from the top. That's less confusing, and we'll look at this from the top in a minute. So when we again look at microscopic anatomy of bone, we're going to find a Haversian canal. We're going to find these little things called lacunae, which the cells live in. We're going to see these things called Folkmans. That's actually pronounced an F. It's German. Folkmans canals or perforating canals. And you're going to see these in a minute. These are going to be little conduits for blood vessels to kind of get from one osteum to another. And then you see little things called canaliculi. And these are connectors that osteoblasts and osteocytes use to connect to other cells. So now we're kind of looking at a top side view of an osteon. So there's one osteon, and notice it's irregularly shaped, because probably what happens is that this one might be running into this one and is slowly eating up away this one as it grows. This is kind of terrible because some of these are dying. So this is probably a dying one that these guys are going to take over, and eventually maybe a new one will form in there, a smaller one right in there. But again, don't worry about that so much. So there's your central or Haversian canal. Okay, there's a concentric rings. Okay, and let me see. There should be a better picture there. Yeah, there's your canaliculi. That's a lacunae. That's a lacunae. Notice it's filled with an osteoclast. And there's a canaliculi, which are little extensions that the cells put out. And literally everything's connected to each other. But notice that the blood vessel here, he's far from the food, far from the oxygen. So what happens is these cells here, when they get blood with nutrients and food, what happens is they eat some of the food and then pass them along, they give them some oxygen. And then what happens is they have wastes that then, because they can't pee, they can't poop, so they have to, there's nowhere to go, so they pass it to them, which is kind of nice. They pass it to them and they put it out into the veins. So that's an incredible complex. And what happens if you get too many layers away, they start to die and another ring will come in and fill in. So as bone grows, these reach a certain discrete size. So again, there's your structure. Haversian canal, lacunae with an osteocyte in it. Usually it's going to be an osteocyte. You have your lacunae. Okay, each sheet is called a lamella, an appositional or a lamella or interstitial lamella. Okay. Now, spongy bone is a nuisance because they have no osteon units. And they mostly align with the stress put on the bone. Matter of fact, this was kind of neat about bone too. A good pathologist or anthropologist can go in, slice up a bone, and tell exactly what kind of stress is by looking at the alignment, typically in the thickness of the compact bone. It's really cool. And again, we used to do this on animals to look at stress and strains on the body. It's really neat. So what we find in trabeculae, they're irregular depositions, random depositions of bones, of bone cells, and the canaliculi. We also find capillaries running along them. So we're not saying much more about spongy bone because you're going to mostly focus on the compact bone. So this is looking at compact bone closer now. Nerve, artery, Persian canal, liquids from the literally capillaries let out liquids, okay, into here. Take up liquids. There's fluid in here that's not dry. So there's your central canal. So what happens is the canaliculi collect that stuff, okay, and put it into the cells, or they release wastes from the cells into there, and actually into your veins. So this is a continuous process. And what happens to them, they have to find canaliculi, and it's not going to be a direct contact, but close, that connect, and they get rid of their waste the long way, and they get their nutrients from hopefully canaliculi and people talking to them. So this is an incredible process when we look at bones. And again, you're going to see that you can get so far away, these concentric or appositional rings can get so far away to the point where you can't nurture that tissue anymore, and that outer layer kind of dies. And then eventually what happens is new bone tissue near it starts to grow and impede and sometimes kills this. It's a dynamic process. So bone is always alive, always growing. If you get a clot in the blood vessels here or some blockage, that will kill off this bone tissue, and this will crumble and die and eventually get absorbed by osteoclasts. So understand that the chemical composition of bones comes from the cells. So in a fetal skeleton, the hyaline cartilage, that cartilage material, first starts out as literally nothing. It's a soft, squishy tissue, okay, an embryonic tissue, okay, that is really not a good matrix of much of anything. It's just a nutrient tissue. So what happens is that in a filler tissue. So what happens with skeletal system, hyaline cartilage is there. And what eventually happens is as blood vessels come into the area and signals, that means some type of hormone, some type of signaling occurs in the body based on the cell's location in the body, based on genetic factors, based on what we call gradients. That means particularly how far away is that part from the head and from the lateral to the medial. It's amazing how this body works, how your body even grows to the point where it does. And it's true for any creature. So what happens is when you have this cartilage, which is secreted by the chondrocytes. Eventually, when bone forms, as the chondrocytes leave town, they either die or just leave town. They're gone. The bone cells come in, osteogenic cells come in, and they first start producing osteoblasts. And then those osteoblasts, actually, what they do is they either degrade the existing collagen connective tissue, or they build into it. So what they do is they turn that connective tissue literally into bone. Osteocytes then, once they mature from osteoblasts, they then maintain that bone tissue. Osteoclasts are there to digest it. So the bone tissue itself was secreted by those osteoblasts. Okay, either from a bone peg that was already there, hyaline cartilage, or being in this mesenchymal tissue that is found literally between the hypodermis and muscle tissue. Okay. The osteoid in itself, okay, is the actual primitive matrix. And I'm not going to make you know that so much. Okay, I don't want to worry about that so much. But the bone tissue itself, the matrix, okay, is to be made up of what's called, like we covered before with any connective tissue, ground substance, which are glue-like proteins. They're glue. And what do they glue together? The collagen fibers. So bone is dense collagen, tightly glued together by this ground substance. Now, guys, this is just like hyaline cartilage again. So how do you make hyaline cartilage into bone? You add a new ground substance. We're going to see you add a calcium type ground substance. And what is that ground substance? Mineral salts called hydroxyapatites. Now, appetite has nothing to do with I have an appetite. It's a name for rock. If you take geology, you've heard of a rock called apatite, and it's called calcium phosphate. And it's a crystal. And you know what? If you put this crystal into hyaline cartilage like makeup, this is like putting rock inside of like, a glue. You now have this hard, flexible surface that can compress, it can take shape, and it has a solid feature to it, and it kind of has some weight to it. So calcium phosphate is not just, there's different types of calcium phosphates, and you can also take in other salts too. So the bone has a mixture of salts. And guys, any salt you eat can end up in bone. Barium can, radium can, other things end up with bone, in bone. Toxic materials can. This is a big problem with bone. As other phosphates can enter the bone, and also other calcium salts, and they can be incorporated by the osteoblasts, particularly, radioactive materials. So the calcium phosphate crystallizes in the bone, and it provides a hardness and resistance to compression. The rest of the matrix gives flexibility and tug, a little springiness to it, but also somewhat of a give. The mixture of these two gives you the properties of your bone: lightweight, somewhat flexible, but also gives resistance, and particularly can bear weight without bending too much. So to kind of review your bone histology, guys, this is complex. It is hard to understand, but just understand the unit of the osteum. Understand why it is what it is. Because as the hyaline cartilage is converted to bone, you'll learn this in the next lecture, a little hole forms in it with blood vessels that provide nutrients and oxygen. And then what happens is that's where now these cells start picking up in a little circle around the campfire, and they build bone. And they then develop into new cells that build bone around them. And then they develop into another outer layer till you can't get any further because there's no food or oxygen available. There's no place to put your poop. So you get this unit that now maintains itself. And every now and then osteoclasts get in there and they chunk it apart, and the existing osteocytes fix it, or if a big chunk is removed totally, osteoblasts have to come in there and save the day. It's an incredible complexity, but understand that it's a dynamic process. And guys, in order for bone itself to grow wider and thicker and longer, these little Folkman's channels have to form. So what happens is that when bone stimulation, like this bone is going to be getting thicker. There's laminate bone right here. When laminate bone gets a signal, it says, wow, we're going to make new bone. So it will do is it will attract basically blood vessels to itself, either from the outside in or from the inside out. And what happens is a little Folkman's channel is dug, okay, and that then brings nutrients where the osteogenic cells can then get the food to produce osteoblasts and develop new osteons here. So as bone thickens, new osteons come into place, and then a new laminate bone layer forms around that. Really cool development. More bone histology. This is what you'd have to recognize on a slide. Guys, now the problem is the virgin canals are usually lacking the blood vessels because they fall out during the histological process. So you're usually not going to see an artery, a vein, and a nerve. But that's where they fit in: artery, vein, and nerve. That's your virgin canals. Okay, there's your, let me put in your osteo. So there's your osteocyte. In mature bone, it's osteocyte. If you're unsure, just put osteocyte. You don't know if it's growing bone or not, so don't put osteoblast. There's another osteocyte. The cavity it's in is called a lacuna. And sometimes you see the lacuna. This one just happens to have cells in it, but sometimes you'll see an empty lacuna. Okay, so the lacuna is the gap that the cells live in. And there's your canaliculi right there. That means little, culi means little, canal means canal. That's easy to remember. So just know this structure. Know these terms. I could ask this on a test. Whoops, I'll put that in brilliant yellow. I could ask this on a test. Osteocyte on a test with lacunae. I could ask conversion canal, and I can ask you what goes through those. So here's your bone quiz. Name that. I could ask you. Spell it correctly, please. Um, you can call it a central canal too. I'll give you credit for that. What passes through it? Okay. What is this cell in here called? Because that's how I'll say it. Or I can say, what is the cavity that the cell is in for, called? I could ask you, what is that structure right there? That's your little canaliculi. I could ask you, what is this overall structure called? Or what is this overall unit of bone called? That's an osteon. I could ask you, what type of bone tissue is this? And you can say compact, or you can say compact osteo, because this would be more of a laminate type next to it. And that's it. So next chapter, we'll cover, next lecture, we'll still be on chapter 6 and talk about bone growth, development, and healing.